Mute from trauma, mocked in town, the cattle baron heard her heart and not her voice. The silent shadow of Cedar Creek. The Texas sun beat down mercilessly on the dusty main street of Cedar Creek, a forgotten town where tumbleweeds rolled past weathered storefronts and the only sounds were the creaking of old wooden signs and the distant lowing of cattle. In this place where time seemed to stand still, Clara Whitmore moved like a ghost among the living. At 22, she possessed a delicate beauty that might have caught many a cowboy's eye, but her silence had become her curse. 3 years had passed since that terrible night when Apache raiders had swept through her family's homestead like a prairie fire, leaving behind only ashes and the haunting memory of her parents' screams. Clara had hidden in the root cellar, watching through a crack in the floorboards as her world burned away. When the sun rose the next morning, she had lost not only her family but her voice as well, as if the horror had stolen the very words from her throat. Now she lived with her Aunt Martha in a cramped room above the general store, earning her keep by mending clothes and cleaning, always under the watchful and often cruel eyes of the townspeople. Children would point and whisper as she passed, calling her the mute girl, while adults spoke in hushed tones about how she might be cursed or touched by madness. "There goes Clara again," Mrs. Henderson would say to her neighbor, not bothering to lower her voice. "Still ain't said a word since that night, probably never will. What man would want a wife who can't even say I do?" Clara's hands would tremble as she clutched her worn shawl tighter, her blue eyes reflecting years of accumulated pain. She had learned to read the cruelty in people's faces, the way they looked right through her as if she were made of glass. The only solace she found was in the abandoned schoolhouse at the edge of town, where she would sit among the dusty books and imagine the stories they might tell. It was there, on a particularly scorching afternoon in late summer, that she first encountered the journal. Left behind by some long-gone teacher, its pages were filled with careful handwriting describing the daily life of the town, the weather patterns, the comings and goings of the residents. Clara found herself drawn to the neat script, running her fingers over the words as if she could absorb their meaning through touch. She had always been able to read and write. Her mother had taught her well before that fateful night, but she had never found cause to use these skills. Now, in the quiet of the schoolhouse, she began to write her own thoughts in the margins of the journal, pouring out her heart in ink when her voice failed her. The sound of heavy boots on the wooden steps outside made her look up sharply. Through the dust-covered window, she could see a tall figure approaching, his silhouette imposing against the harsh afternoon light. Clara quickly closed the journal and pressed herself against the wall, her heart pounding as the door creaked open. "Well, I'll be damned," came a deep, gravelly voice. Thought this place was empty. The man who entered was unlike anyone Clara had ever seen in Cedar Creek. Tall and broad-shouldered, with dark hair touched by silver at the temples, and eyes the color of storm clouds, he moved with the confidence of a man accustomed to command. His clothes were fine but practical, a black leather vest over a white shirt, dark trousers and boots that spoke of long hours in the saddle. This was clearly a man of means, and Clara instinctively knew he must be the cattle baron she had heard whispered about in the streets. Elijah Thornton had built his empire through sheer will and an iron fist, controlling thousands of acres of prime grazing land and the largest herd in 3 counties. Men feared him, women desired him, and everyone respected him. But as he stood in the doorway of the abandoned schoolhouse, there was something almost vulnerable in his expression. As he took in the sight of the young woman pressed against the wall, "I didn't mean to startle you, miss," he said, his voice gentler now. "I was looking for someone who might be able to help me with some correspondence. Heard there might be someone in town who could read and write proper." Clara's eyes darted to the journal still clutched in her hands, then back to the imposing figure before her. She wanted to flee, to disappear into the shadows as she always did, but something in his manner held her still. There was no mockery in his eyes, no cruel amusement at her obvious fear. "I'm Elijah Thornton," he continued, removing his hat respectfully. "I run the Silver Oak Ranch about 10 miles north of here. I've got need of someone who can handle my books and letters. Someone discreet." Clara's aunt had always told her that her affliction would make her unmarriageable, unemployable, a burden to bear for the rest of her days. But here was a man who seemed to see past her silence to something else entirely. When she held up the journal, showing him the neat handwriting in the margins, his eyes widened with something that might have been respect. "You wrote this?" he asked, stepping closer to examine the pages. Clara nodded, her pulse quickening as he read her words aloud. The morning brought with it a sense of longing I cannot name, as if the very air itself mourned for what was lost. He looked up at her with new interest. "You have a gift, miss. What's your name?" Clara pointed to herself and then mimed writing. Understanding immediately, Elijah handed her a pencil from his vest pocket. With trembling hands, she wrote her name in the dust on the windowsill. "Clara, Clara," he repeated, and somehow her name sounded different on his lips, not like a curse but like a prayer. Would you be willing to come work for me, Clara? I can offer you a room in the main house, good meals, and wages that would set you up comfortable. All I ask is that you help me with my correspondence and keep my books in order." The offer hung in the air between them like a lifeline thrown to a drowning woman. Clara had never imagined that her silence might not be a hindrance, but perhaps even an asset to someone who valued discretion. She looked into Elijah's eyes and saw something she had rarely encountered in Cedar Creek: genuine kindness. With a shaky hand, she wrote in the dust beneath her name, "Yes." As the afternoon sun began to sink toward the horizon, painting the sky in shades of amber and rose, Clara Whitmore prepared to leave the only home she had known since that terrible night. She didn't know what awaited her at the Silver Oak Ranch, but for the first time in 3 years she felt something stir within her chest that might have been hope. The town of Cedar Creek would have one less shadow to whisper about, and perhaps, just perhaps, Clara might finally find a place where her silence could speak volumes. The language of Silver Oak. The Silver Oak Ranch stretched across the horizon like a kingdom carved from the very earth itself, its boundaries marked by endless wooden fences and rolling hills dotted with grazing cattle. Clara pressed her face to the window of Elijah's wagon as they approached the main house, her breath fogging the glass as she took in the sight of her new home. The house itself was a testament to prosperity and good taste, built from honey-colored stone with a wide wraparound porch supported by thick columns. Live oak trees, their branches heavy with Spanish moss, provided shade and gave the ranch its name. Everything about the place spoke of permanence and stability, qualities that had been absent from Clara's life for far too long. "Been building this place for nigh on 15 years, Elijah said, following her gaze. "Started with nothing but a one-room cabin and a dream. Now I've got 2,000 head of cattle and the finest breeding stock in Texas." There was pride in his voice, but also something else, a loneliness that Clara recognized all too well. The wagon came to a stop before the main entrance, and Elijah helped Clara down with a gentleness that surprised her. Her few possessions, a small satchel containing 2 dresses, her mother's Bible, and the journal from the schoolhouse, seemed pitiful against the grandeur of her surroundings. "Maria," Elijah called out, and a plump Mexican woman emerged from the house, wiping her hands on her apron. Her dark eyes were kind but curious as they took in the sight of the young woman beside her employer. "Senor Thornton, you have brought a guest?" "This is Clara," Elijah said. "She'll be staying with us, helping with the correspondence and bookkeeping. Clara, this is Maria Santos. She's been keeping this house running since my wife." He paused, a shadow passing over his features. "She'll help you get settled." Maria's expression softened immediately. "Bienvenida, niña. Welcome. You look like you could use a good meal and some rest. Come, come." Clara found herself swept into Maria's capable care, led through rooms filled with dark wood furniture and tasteful decorations. The house was larger than anything she had ever lived in, with a library that made her gasp with delight and a kitchen that smelled of fresh bread and herbs. "Senor Thornton, he is a good man," Maria said as she showed Clara to her room on the 2nd floor. "He has been alone too long, I think. Perhaps you will bring some light back to this house, see?" The room was simple but comfortable, with a window that looked out over the pastures toward the distant mountains. Clara sat on the bed and pulled out the journal, writing quickly, "Thank you for your kindness. I will work hard to earn my place here." Maria read the words and smiled warmly. "You have beautiful handwriting, Nina, and such expressive eyes. You will do well here, I think." Over the next few days, Clara began to establish a routine that felt more natural than anything she had experienced in years. Each morning she would wake before dawn to the sound of roosters crowing and cowboys calling to their horses. She would dress quickly and make her way to Elijah's study, where stacks of letters and business documents awaited her attention. Elijah's correspondence was extensive: letters from cattle buyers in Kansas City, reports from his foreman scattered across the ranch, legal documents related to land purchases and water rights. Clara discovered that she had a natural aptitude for organization and a keen eye for detail. She began to create a system for filing and tracking the various business dealings, using her neat handwriting to summarize important points and flag items that required Elijah's immediate attention. "You're a godsend," Elijah told her one morning as she handed him a stack of letters she had sorted and prioritized. "I've been drowning in paperwork for months. My previous clerk was unreliable." Clara smiled and wrote on a piece of paper, "I enjoy the work. It makes me feel useful." "You are useful," Elijah said firmly, "more than you know." But it wasn't just the work that brought Clara contentment. For the first time since the attack, she felt safe. The ranch hands tipped their hats respectfully when they passed her, and Maria treated her like a beloved daughter. Most importantly, Elijah never made her feel like her silence was a burden or a flaw to be pitied. In the evenings, after the day's work was done, Clara would often find herself drawn to the wide front porch where Elijah would sit smoking his pipe and watching the sunset paint the sky in brilliant colors. At first, she would simply sit in the chair beside him, both of them comfortable in the shared silence. But gradually, she began to bring her journal, writing observations about the ranch life and the beauty of the landscape. "The sunset tonight reminds me of my mother's hair," she wrote one evening, showing Elijah the page. "Golden with threads of copper, warm and soft." Elijah read the words carefully, then looked at her with something approaching wonder. "You have a poet's soul, Clara. Don't ever let anyone tell you that silence means you have nothing to say." It was during one of these evening conversations, conducted entirely through written notes and meaningful glances, that Clara learned about Elijah's own pain. His wife, Catherine, had died in childbirth 5 years earlier, along with their infant son. The loss had hardened him, made him retreat from the world and focus entirely on building his empire. "I thought if I could just make the ranch successful enough, big enough, it would fill the emptiness," he wrote in response to one of her gentle questions. "But you can't buy back what you've lost, can you?" Clara wrote back. "No, but perhaps we can find new reasons to hope." Their relationship deepened through these written exchanges, two wounded souls finding solace in each other's understanding. Clara began to venture out into the ranch itself, watching the cowboys work with the cattle and marveling at the skill required to manage such a massive operation. It was during one of these explorations that she encountered Thunder, a magnificent black stallion that had been giving the ranch hands trouble. The horse had been abused by his previous owner and was now almost impossible to approach, rearing and striking at anyone who came near. "That horse is mean as a rattlesnake," warned Jake, one of the older cowboys. "Boss has been talking about putting him down." But Clara saw something different in Thunder's wild eyes. Not meanness, but fear. That afternoon, she returned to the corral with an apple from Maria's kitchen and sat on the fence, making no move to approach the horse. Instead, she simply waited, her presence calm and non-threatening. Thunder watched her warily, but curiosity eventually overcame his fear. He approached slowly, his nostrils flaring as he caught the scent of the apple. When he finally took it from her outstretched hand, his touch was gentle, almost reverent. "Well, I'll be damned," came Elijah's voice from behind her. "He's never let anyone get that close." Clara turned to find Elijah leaning against the corral fence, his expression amazed. She wrote quickly on a piece of paper, "He's not mean, he's just afraid." Sometimes silence is the only language fear understands. Elijah read the words and looked at her with new respect. "You understand him because you've been there yourself." Clara nodded, then wrote, "Maybe I can help him learn to trust again." "Maybe you can help us all learn that," Elijah said softly. As the weeks passed, Clara's relationship with Thunder became the talk of the ranch. She would spend hours with him, never pushing, never demanding, simply being present until he began to associate her with safety and comfort. The other horses seemed to sense her gift as well, and soon she was helping with the training of the younger animals. But it was her growing connection with Elijah that truly transformed her life. What had begun as a working relationship had deepened into something neither of them had expected. He began to seek her out not just for business matters, but for her company, her quiet wisdom, and the unique perspective she brought to every situation. "You see things others miss," he told her one evening as they sat on the porch watching the stars emerge. "Maybe because you've learned to listen with more than just your ears," Clara wrote, "and maybe you've learned to hear with more than just your ears." The understanding between them was growing into something beautiful and profound, but both knew that their peace was fragile. Dark clouds were gathering on the horizon, both literal and metaphorical, and soon their newfound happiness would be put to the test. Storms on the horizon. The first sign of trouble came with the drought. By late spring, the usual rains that should have greened the pastures had failed to materialize, leaving the grass brown and brittle beneath the relentless Texas sun. The creek that gave Cedar Creek its name had dwindled to a muddy trickle, and the cattle had to be driven farther and farther from the ranch to find adequate grazing. Clara watched from the porch as Elijah consulted with his foreman, their voices carried on the hot wind that seemed to blow constantly now. The men's faces were grim as they discussed water rights and the possibility of driving the herd north to better pasture. "We're going to lose half the herd if this keeps up," Jake reported, his weathered face creased with worry. "The younger calves especially. They can't handle this heat without proper water." Elijah's jaw tightened as he absorbed the news. "What about the Watson place? They still got water?" "Some, but old man Watson ain't selling. Says he needs every drop for his own stock." Clara had been keeping meticulous records of the ranch's finances, and she knew better than anyone how precarious their situation was becoming. The cost of feed was rising as local suppliers struggled with their own drought-related problems, and several major cattle buyers had already postponed their purchases until the market stabilized. That evening, she found Elijah in his study, staring at a map of the region with a glass of whiskey in his hand. The usual confidence that radiated from him had been replaced by something closer to desperation. 20 years I've been building this place, he said without looking up. 20 years of blood, sweat, and sacrifice. And now Mother Nature might take it all away with a snap of her fingers. Clara sat down across from him and wrote, "You're stronger than you know. The ranch is more than just land and cattle. It's a testament to your will. That can't be taken away by drought or anything else." Elijah read her words and managed a weak smile. You always know what to say, even when you're not saying anything. But Clara's comfort was short-lived. The next morning brought news that would test both their resolve and their growing relationship. A rider galloped into the yard, his horse lathered with sweat and his face grim with urgency. "Mr. Thornton," he called out, "there's trouble at the north pasture. Someone's been cutting fence and running off cattle." Elijah's expression hardened immediately. "How many head?" "Near as we can tell, maybe 50. All prime breeding stock." Clara felt her blood run cold. Cattle rustling was more than just theft. It was a direct challenge to Elijah's authority and a threat to everything they had built together. She watched as he strapped on his gun belt and prepared to ride out with his men. "Stay close to the house," he told her, his voice tense. "If this is what I think it is, things might get dangerous." Clara wrote quickly, "Who would do this?" "Marcus Brennan," Elijah replied, and the name seemed to leave a bitter taste in his mouth. "He's been trying to buy my land for years. Guess he decided to try a different approach." Marcus Brennan was a name Clara had heard whispered in the business correspondence she managed. He owned a smaller ranch to the east and had been systematically acquiring properties throughout the region, often through questionable means. His letters to Elijah had grown increasingly aggressive in recent months, with thinly veiled threats disguised as business propositions. As Elijah and his men rode out to investigate the theft, Clara found herself pacing the house like a caged animal. The thought of anything happening to Elijah filled her with a terror she hadn't felt since the night her family was killed. She had found safety and purpose at Silver Oak, but more than that, she had found love, even if neither of them had yet spoken the word aloud. Maria tried to comfort her, but Clara could see the worry in the older woman's eyes as well. "Senor Thornton, he is a good man, but he has enemies," Maria said. "This Brennan, he is not a man to make empty threats." The men returned at dusk, their faces grim and their horses exhausted. Clara rushed to meet them, her heart pounding as she searched Elijah's face for answers. "Found where they cut the fence," he reported. "Professional job done in the dark. They knew exactly which cattle to take and how to get them out without being seen." Clara wrote, "What will you do?" "I'm riding to town tomorrow to talk to the sheriff. Not that it'll do much good. Brennan's got half the county in his pocket." That night, Clara lay awake listening to the sounds of the ranch, the lowing of cattle, the night calls of the cowboys on watch, the rustle of wind through the oak trees. But underneath it all, she sensed something else, a tension in the air that spoke of approaching storm. Her instincts proved correct. The next morning, as Elijah prepared to ride to town, another crisis emerged. Thunder, the wild stallion she had worked so hard to tame, was missing from his corral. The gate stood open and there were signs of a struggle in the dirt. "They took him," Jake said, his voice tight with anger. "Brennan's boys left this behind." He handed Elijah a piece of paper with a crude message scrawled across it. "Stop asking questions about missing cattle, or the horse won't be the only thing that disappears." Clara felt as though she had been punched in the stomach. Thunder wasn't just a horse to her. He was a symbol of her own healing, proof that damaged souls could learn to trust again. The thought of him in the hands of cruel men made her physically ill. "I'm going to kill him," Elijah said, his voice deadly calm. "I'm going to ride over there and put a bullet in Marcus Brennan's head." Clara grabbed his arm and shook her head violently, then wrote with shaking hands, "That's what he wants. He's trying to provoke you into doing something stupid. Don't give him the satisfaction." "So what do you suggest?" Elijah asked, his frustration evident. "Let him steal from me? Let him threaten everyone I care about?" Clara stared at the last part of his statement, the words, "everyone I care about," echoing in her mind. Despite everything they had shared, this was the closest either of them had come to acknowledging the depth of their feelings. She wrote, "We're smarter than him. We can find another way." "What way?" "The law won't help us. The sheriff's either bought or too scared to stand up to Brennan." Clara thought for a moment, then wrote, "Then we make our own justice, but we do it carefully, with proof that can't be denied." That evening, as they sat on the porch despite the oppressive heat, Clara outlined her plan. She had been keeping detailed records of all the ranch's business dealings, including careful notes about the missing cattle and the threatening messages. If they could gather enough evidence of Brennan's crimes, they could present a case that even a corrupt sheriff would have trouble ignoring. "You want to catch him in the act," Elijah said, reading her notes. "But that means putting yourself in danger." Clara wrote, "I can move quietly. People don't notice me the way they notice you. I can get close enough to see what's really happening. Absolutely not, Elijah said firmly. I won't have you risking your life for my problems. Clara wrote, your problems are my problems now. This is my home too. The simple statement hung between them like a declaration of war against the forces that threatened their peace. Clara had found her voice not in words, but in action, and she was prepared to fight for what she had found at Silver Oak. As the night deepened, and the first rumbles of thunder echoed across the sky, both Clara and Elijah knew that their quiet life was about to change forever. The storm that was coming would test not just their courage but their faith in each other, and in the possibility of building something beautiful from the ashes of their past pain. The drought was about to break, but the real tempest was just beginning, the fire that speaks. The breakthrough came 3 days later when Clara made a discovery that would change everything. While organizing Elijah's correspondence, she found a letter that had been misfiled, a communication from a cattle buyer in Kansas City that mentioned purchasing exceptional breeding stock from a Marcus Brennan, stock that matched exactly the description of the animal stolen from Silver Oak. Clara's hands trembled as she read the letter again, her heart pounding with excitement and fear. This was the evidence they needed, proof that Brennan wasn't just stealing cattle but had an entire network set up to profit from his crimes. But it also meant that the danger was far greater than they had imagined. She was so absorbed in her discovery that she didn't hear the footsteps on the porch until it was too late. The study door burst open and 3 men stepped inside, their faces hard and their hands resting on their gun belts. Clara recognized the leader immediately, Marcus Brennan himself, a tall man with cold eyes and a smile that never reached them. Well, well, Brennan said, his voice smooth as silk. The famous mute girl. I've heard so much about you. Clara instinctively clutched the letter to her chest, her mind racing as she tried to think of a way to escape, but the men had positioned themselves to block both the door and the window, trapping her in the room. Now don't be afraid, Brennan continued, advancing slowly. I just want to have a little chat. You see, I've been doing some thinking about your boss and his stubborn refusal to sell his land, and I realized that maybe I've been approaching this all wrong. He reached out and plucked the letter from Clara's hands, scanning it quickly before a satisfied smile crossed his face. This is very interesting indeed. You know, I was wondering how Thornton was going to prove his accusations, but it looks like you've done all the work for me. Clara tried to back away, but one of Brennan's men stepped forward, grabbing her arm roughly. She opened her mouth to scream, but as always, no sound emerged. The familiar feeling of helplessness washed over her, the same terrible silence that had haunted her for 3 years. The beautiful thing about dealing with someone like you, Brennan said, striking a match and holding it close to the letter, is that you can't exactly run and tell anyone what you've seen, can you? The letter caught fire, and with it Clara watched their only hope of justice turn to ash. But as the flames danced before her eyes, something else ignited within her, a rage that had been building for years, fed by every cruel word, every pitying look, every moment she had been made to feel less than human because of her silence. You know what I think? Brennan continued, unaware of the storm building in Clara's eyes. I think poor Thornton is going to be devastated when he comes home to find his house burned to the ground. Tragic accident, really. These old places, they go up so fast. One of his men pulled out a bottle of kerosene and began splashing it around the room. The smell filled Clara's nostrils, triggering memories of that terrible night when her family had died. But this time, she wasn't a helpless child hiding in a root cellar. This time, she could fight back. As the man with the kerosene turned away from her, Clara grabbed the heavy brass inkwell from Elijah's desk and brought it down on his head with all her strength. He crumpled to the floor, and in the confusion that followed, she managed to break free from the grip of the second man. Get her, Brennan shouted, but Clara was already moving, her years of silent observation having taught her every inch of the house. She darted through the doorway and down the hall, her feet flying over the polished wooden floors. Behind her she could hear the men giving chase, their heavy boots thundering through the house. She burst through the kitchen door, startling Maria, who was preparing dinner. Nina, what is wrong? Clara grabbed a piece of paper and wrote frantically, Fire, men, danger, get help. Maria's eyes widened in understanding, and she immediately began shouting in Spanish to the ranch hands outside. But Clara couldn't wait to see if help would arrive in time. She could smell smoke beginning to fill the air, and she knew that Brennan's men would set the house ablaze whether she escaped or not. She ran toward the barn, her mind racing with desperate plans. If she could get to Thunder, assuming he was still alive, she might be able to ride for help. But as she reached the barn doors, she found them blocked by another of Brennan's men. End of the line, little lady, he said, drawing his gun. Boss wants to make sure you don't cause any more trouble. Clara backed away slowly, her eyes darting around the barn for anything she could use as a weapon. Her gaze fell on the hay bales stacked near the back wall, and suddenly, she had an idea. If Brennan wanted to use fire as a weapon, perhaps she could turn that against him. She pretended to stumble, falling near a pile of hay and the kerosene lamp that hung from a nearby post. The man with the gun stepped closer, confident in his advantage, but Clara had spent months working with frightened animals and had learned to move with swift, decisive action when necessary. She grabbed the lamp and hurled it at the hay bales, which erupted in flames with a whoosh that filled the barn with orange light. The man jumped back, momentarily blinded, and Clara seized her chance to run. But as she burst from the barn, she realized that her desperate gambit had set in motion events she couldn't control. The flames were spreading faster than she had anticipated, and the wind was carrying burning hay toward the main house. In the distance, she could see Elijah and his men riding hard toward the ranch, alerted by the column of smoke rising into the sky. But they were still minutes away, and Clara knew that minutes might be too long. She ran toward the house, her heart breaking as she watched the flames beginning to lick at the porch where she and Elijah had spent so many peaceful evenings. Everything she had found here, safety, purpose, love, was about to be destroyed by her own actions. But then she saw him, Thunder, magnificent and wild, racing across the pasture toward the chaos. Brennan's men had apparently turned him loose when they realized their plan was failing, and now he was running straight toward the fire that terrified him. Clara stood in the middle of the yard, her arms outstretched, calling to him with every fiber of her being. She couldn't make a sound, but she poured all her love, all her desperation, all her hope into her gesture. And somehow, miraculously, Thunder heard her. He slowed as he approached, his eyes wide with fear but trusting in her presence. Clara grabbed his mane and pulled herself onto his back, feeling the familiar connection that had grown between them over the months of patient work. Together they rode toward the well, Clara's mind focused on one desperate plan. If she could get enough water to the house, she might be able to save at least part of it. But as they reached the well, she realized that Thunder wasn't just carrying her, he was carrying her voice. For the first time in 3 years, Clara Whitmore opened her mouth and screamed. The sound that emerged was raw and primal, a cry that carried 3 years of pain and fury and desperate love. It rose above the crackling of the flames and the shouts of the men, a sound that seemed to shake the very foundations of the earth. Elijah heard it from half a mile away, and his heart nearly stopped. He had never heard Clara's voice, but he knew instantly that the sound cutting through the smoke and chaos was hers. He drove his horse harder, his men struggling to keep up as he raced toward the woman who had become his whole world. Clara's scream seemed to unlock something inside her, and suddenly she was shouting instructions to the ranch hands, her voice hoarse but clear. The well, form a bucket line, save the stables first. The men, shocked by the sudden emergence of her voice, nevertheless responded instantly to her commands. They had all come to respect the quiet woman who had brought peace to their wildest horses, and now they saw her as a leader worth following. As Elijah finally reached the ranch, he found Clara directing the firefighting efforts with the same calm precision she had brought to his correspondence. Her face was streaked with soot and her dress was singed, but her eyes blazed with determination. "Clara!" he shouted, leaping from his horse and running to her. "Are you hurt?" "I'm fine," she said, and the sound of her voice speaking his name was like music to his ears. "But Brennan, he has proof destroyed. He's getting away." Elijah looked around at the chaos, then back at Clara's soot-stained face. "I don't care about Brennan. I don't care about any of it. I only care about you." He pulled her into his arms, holding her tight against his chest as the fire raged around them. "I thought I'd lost you," he whispered. "I thought I'd lost everything." "You found me," Clara replied, her voice growing stronger with each word. "And I found my voice. I found it because I had something worth fighting for." The fire continued to burn, but it no longer seemed unstoppable. The ranch hands had managed to save the stables and most of the outbuildings, and while the main house was badly damaged, it could be rebuilt. More importantly, they had saved each other. As the sun began to set, painting the smoke-filled sky in shades of orange and red, Clara and Elijah stood together in the ruins of their home, their hands intertwined and their hearts full of hope. The fire had taken much, but it had also given them something precious, the knowledge that their love was strong enough to survive any storm. The voice of tomorrow dawn broke over Silver Oak Ranch with a gentleness that seemed almost miraculous after the chaos of the night before. The acrid smell of smoke still lingered in the air, but it was gradually being replaced by the sweeter scents of morning dew and prairie grass. Clara stood on what remained of the front porch, watching the sun paint the sky in shades of gold and pink, and marveled at how different the world looked when viewed through the lens of hope. "The damage isn't as bad as it could have been," Elijah said, joining her with 2 cups of coffee that Maria had somehow managed to brew over a campfire. "The main structure is sound. We can rebuild." Clara accepted the coffee gratefully, her throat still raw from the previous night's shouting. "We will rebuild," she said, her voice growing stronger with each word. "And this time, we'll build it together." The night had changed everything between them. The crisis had stripped away the careful politeness and unspoken boundaries that had defined their relationship, leaving behind only the essential truth. They loved each other, and that love was worth fighting for. "I've been thinking," Elijah said, his hand finding hers. "About Brenny?"